The rain had fallen for days, not in sheets but in an relentless weeping despair that had swallowed the town of Havenwood whole. What hope could bloom in a place consumed by the rising tide, where houses sank like forgotten prayers, and the very air hung heavy with the stench of decay and drowned dreams? This wasn't the new life promised, the fertile land, the sturdy home, the husband ready to build a future. This was a watery grave, and she, Alara, the mail-order bride, was its latest offering, left stranded on a porch that was slowly becoming an island, watching the last vestiges of her meager possessions drift away. Her trunk, once a symbol of escape, now a waterlogged coffin of what-ifs. The silence was broken only by the lapping of the dark water against the warped timber of her temporary prison, and the distant mournful creak of straining wood. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The world had promised salvation, a fresh start in the burgeoning West, a haven from the suffocating shadows of a past she desperately sought to outrun. But Havenwood was anything but a haven. It was a testament to nature's indifference, a chilling metaphor for the fragility of human endeavor. Her gaze drifted over the submerged fields, the ghostly silhouettes of trees, each one a stark skeletal finger pointing to a sky that wept unendingly. She had arrived 3 days prior, expecting a bustling town, a waiting fiancé, a destiny. Instead, she found an eerie silence, a deserted general store, and a note tacked to a ruined post office, hastily scrawled, "Evacuate, flood coming, last train left." He hadn't waited. He hadn't cared. The truth settled heavy in her gut, a cold, bitter stone. She was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone, a forgotten parcel in a drowned world. The water swirled around the porch posts, its insidious currents reaching higher, threatening to claim the last dry sliver of her existence. Every breath was a shallow gasp, a desperate prayer against the inevitable, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Fear, raw and primal, clawed at her throat, yet beneath it simmered a stubborn, fiery anger. How dare he? How dare life twist this cruel knife? The sun, a distant, mocking memory, had retreated behind a perpetual shroud of gray, leaving her in a desolate twilight that seemed to mirror the dimming light within her own soul. The river, once a whisper, was now a roaring, hungry beast, its maw open wide. A shadow detached itself from the muted haze upstream, growing steadily, improbably large. It was a horse, dark and powerful, cutting through the water with an almost mythical ease, its rider a stoic, unyielding silhouette against the dismal backdrop. He was a man forged of grim resolve, cloaked in weather-beaten leather, a wide-brimmed hat obscuring his face save for the formidable set of his jaw. He was a specter of the old world, a relic of frontier survival, and he rode as if the very floods were his dominion. As he drew closer, the details of his grim appearance sharpened, the hard glint in his eyes, the subtle tension in his broad shoulders, and the deep, jagged scars that marred one side of his face, a testament to battles fought and won, or perhaps simply endured. He was Elias, a ranger, though the title felt too civil for the raw power he exuded. His gaze, unblinking and direct, swept over the devastation, then fixed on her, Alara, clinging to the porch railing like a shipwrecked survivor. No pity softened his features, only a hardened assessment, a detached calculation. He didn't speak, didn't offer a platitude. Instead, with a practiced grace born of necessity, he reined in his horse, a behemoth of muscle and will, beside her precarious perch. The animal snorted, its breath a cloud in the damp air, its eyes wide and intelligent. The ranger's silence was more intimidating than any shout, a stark reminder of her powerlessness, her utter dependence on whatever fleeting mercy this grim apparition might offer. His hand, calloused and strong, reached out, not gently, but with a brusque command, a silent, unyielding demand for her to comply. Her breath hitched. The ranger's hand, calloused and resolute, extended towards her, not as an invitation, but as an undeniable decree. Alara hesitated, her gaze darting from the dark, swirling water below to the forbidding contours of his face, etched with a lifetime of harshness. He was an enigma, a man carved from the very wilderness they navigated, and his silence was a heavy shroud. Her heart hammered, a trapped bird against the cage of her ribs. Every instinct screamed caution, whispered of dangers far greater than the rising floodwaters. But the alternative was certain doom, a slow, cold surrender to the relentless currents that nibbled at the last dry planks of her porch. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the water would claim her if she remained. This man, this scarred stranger, was her only impossible escape. With a surge of desperate resolve, she reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the rough leather of his glove. His grip was immediate, unyielding, almost bruising in its strength, pulling her forward without ceremony or preamble. She stumbled, awkward and ungraceful, over the slick, warped wood, half climbing, half being hauled onto the formidable saddle behind him. The horse, a powerful mare with an almost supernatural calm, remained steady despite the shift in weight, its muscles rippling beneath her. The damp wool of the ranger's coat was rough against her cheek as she clung to his back, a precarious hold against the relentless sway of the current. The chill of the water seeped through her thin dress, and she shivered, not just from the cold, but from the raw proximity of this man, this force of nature. He was a mystery wrapped in a shroud of taciturnity, his presence both terrifying and strangely reassuring. He barely acknowledged her once she was aboard, his gaze fixed on the endless expanse of water ahead. The rhythm of the horse's powerful strides became her only anchor in a world turned fluid and treacherous. They moved through the submerged town, a ghost ship navigating a spectral cityscape, the occasional peak of a rooftop, a submerged church spire, a floating piece of furniture. Each was a poignant, fleeting reminder of lives disrupted, homes destroyed. The ranger, Elias, navigated with an unnerving precision, his knowledge of these drowned lands seemingly innate, his senses finely attuned to the unseen currents and hidden dangers beneath the surface. He was a silent sentinel, a guardian against the very chaos that surrounded them, yet his motivations remained an unreadable cipher. Ilara found herself studying the broad expanse of his back, the way his shoulders tensed with each powerful thrust of the horse through the water, the almost imperceptible shifts of his weight that guided their path. The scars on his face were a constant, visible testament to a past she couldn't fathom, a grim badge of experience that hinted at a deeper story of hardship and survival. She wondered what battles he had fought, what losses he had endured to earn such indelible marks. The journey was long, punctuated only by the rhythmic splash of the horse's hooves and the muted creak of the saddle. Time lost all meaning, dissolving into a continuous, anxious present. They passed no other souls, no signs of life, only the desolation of a world unmade. Her initial terror began to give way to a creeping weariness, a profound exhaustion that threatened to swallow her whole. The cold gnawed at her, and hunger was a dull ache in her stomach. Still, the ranger remained stoic, a pillar of endurance. He never looked back, never spoke, never offered a word of comfort or explanation. His silence was a wall, impenetrable and absolute, and yet, paradoxically, it offered a strange sort of comfort. He was a shield against the chaos, a silent promise of survival in a world that had betrayed her. It was a fragile, desperate hope, born of necessity, but a hope nonetheless. The sky remained an unbroken expanse of gray, but as the light began to fade, a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere hinted at a reprieve from the relentless rain. The air grew colder, sharpening the edges of the despair that clung to her. She didn't know where he was taking her, or why he had chosen to pluck her from the rising tide. The mysteries of this grim rescuer began to overshadow the immediate danger of the flood, replacing one anxiety with another, deeper one. What was his purpose? What did he expect from her? The questions hung in the chill, damp air, unspoken and unanswered, adding another layer of tension to their harrowing, silent odyssey. As dusk deepened, painting the desolate landscape in shades of bruised purple and inky black, Elias finally guided the horse towards a slight rise of land, crowned by the skeletal remains of what appeared to be an old, dilapidated hunting cabin. It was barely more than a shell, its roof partially collapsed, one wall leaning precariously as if resigned to its own inevitable decay. Yet in the vast, watery expanse, it was a beacon, a desperate promise of solid ground. The horse splashed onto the muddy bank, its powerful legs churning through the clinging muck, and the shift from water to earth was a jolt, a sudden, unfamiliar stability that made Alara's head spin. Elias dismounted with a practiced ease, his movements economical, his focus unwavering. He didn't offer a hand, didn't even glance back, simply moved to secure the horse to a gnarled, ancient tree. His actions were those of a man accustomed to solitude, to the harsh realities of survival, to relying solely on himself. Alara slid from the saddle, her legs weak and unsteady beneath her, almost collapsing into the cold, viscous mud. A faint grunt of exasperation escaped Elias's lips, though whether directed at her or the situation she couldn't tell. He was a creature of the wild, unburdened by pleasantries or expectations of tenderness. She stumbled towards the cabin, its shadowed interior promising only more damp and cold, but also a semblance of shelter from the omnipresent rain. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and decaying wood, yet the wind no longer bit at her skin with such ferocity. Elias followed, his presence a heavy weight in the small space. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his gaze sweeping over the cabin's meager offerings: a rusted stove, a broken cot, the skeletal remains of a table. He retrieved a worn canvas bag from the horse, his movements precise and purposeful. The scratch of a match, a brief surprising flare of light, then the dull glow of a small fire igniting within the rusted stove. The warmth, faint at first, was a small miracle, a whisper of hope in the suffocating darkness. Alara huddled near it, extending her chilled hands towards the hesitant flames, watching the light dance across the ranger's stern features. His face, illuminated by the flickering firelight, was a map of past struggles, the scars more pronounced, lending him an almost mythic, tragic air. He produced a small, dented tin and a flask, pouring a meager portion of lukewarm coffee into a single cup. He offered it to her, his hand extended, not with a question, but with a silent expectation. Their first real interaction, defined by a shared need and a grudging gesture of provision. Alara took the cup, her fingers brushing against his. The brief contact was jarring, a spark of unexpected sensation in the numb landscape of her fear. The coffee was bitter, scalding, but it brought a jolt of warmth to her core, chasing away some of the gnawing cold. She drank it slowly, savoring the simple comfort. "Why?" she managed, her voice a reedy whisper, raw from disuse and fear. The single word hung in the damp air, loaded with unspoken questions. Why me? Why help? Why are you here? Elias didn't answer immediately. He stared into the nascent flames, his silence profound, stretching thin between them until it felt like a taut wire. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, rough like stones grinding against each other. No one else. The words were blunt, devoid of emotion, yet they held a devastating truth. There was no one else. He hadn't rescued her out of gallantry or kindness, but out of a stark, unbending necessity. He was the only one left to offer aid, and she, the only one left to need it. The realization was both crushing and strangely liberating. There was no pretense here, no false promises. This was the stark, brutal reality of survival. He then spoke again, terse and direct. "We move at first light, north. This place won't hold." The simple statement was a command, a chilling prognosis. The flood was not over, and this fragile shelter was only a temporary reprieve. He was a man of action, of grim necessity, and she, a reluctant passenger on his arduous, uncertain journey. The sparse dialogue settled between them like a heavy shroud, wrapping their weary forms in an uncomfortable silence. Alara watched Elias, observed the way he moved in the flickering firelight. Precise, economical, every action driven by an unspoken imperative. He was a creature of solitude, a living testament to harsh landscapes and harder truths. He cleaned his rifle with meticulous care, the oiled click of its mechanisms the only sound besides the crackle of the fire. The air, thick with the scent of wet earth and gun oil, seemed to press in on them, narrowing their world to the confines of this decaying cabin. She felt the urge to ask more questions, to unravel the mystery of this man, but the words caught in her throat. His aura of grim determination was a barrier, more formidable than any physical wall. She tried to piece together her own fractured memories, the flimsy tapestry of hope that had brought her here. A faded daguerreotype of a smiling man, his face obscured by the passage of time and distance, had been her only companion on the long, dusty journey west. He had promised a new beginning, a clean slate, a life free from the whispers and judgments of her past. She had fled a scandal, a small-town drama that had branded her, leaving an indelible stain on her reputation. A broken engagement, a ruined family name. The specifics mattered less than the suffocating weight of societal condemnation. Flashback. Ilara, younger, her hands clenched in the folds of her simple Sunday dress, her face pale. Voices, sharp and venomous, echo through the empty church hall, painting her with broad strokes of indecency and shame. The weight of their gazes, the biting silence of her own family, pushing her towards an impossible choice, a chance to escape, to reinvent herself where no one knew her past, offered through the cold, impersonal words of a mail-order bride advertisement. The desperate hope, fragile as spun glass, that this new land, this new man, would offer redemption. The memory flickered, then receded, leaving behind a bitter aftertaste. Redemption seemed a cruel jest now, a forgotten dream lost in the vastness of the flood. She was no longer a hopeful bride, but a survivor, stripped bare of illusions. Elias, sensing her gaze, looked up, his eyes, dark and fathomless, meeting hers across the fire. There was no judgment in them, no pity, only a deep, abiding weariness that seemed to mirror her own. It was a fleeting moment of connection, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared hardship. He then rose, retrieved a thin, worn blanket from his bag, and tossed it towards her. "Rest," he grunted, his voice gruff, devoid of softening. It wasn't an offer, but a command, a practical directive. He settled near the stove, his back to her, his form a silent, formidable presence. The blanket was rough, but the small warmth it offered was a comfort, a tangible sign of a grudging provision. She lay down on the cold, damp floor, the sound of the wind rattling the loose panes of the cabin, the distant gurgle of the receding floodwaters, and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the ranger filling the void. Sleep came in fits and starts, punctuated by the vivid imagery of her own drowning town, and the chilling realization that she was tethered to a man whose past was as shadowed and scarred as his very face. The darkness held secrets, both outside the cabin and within the man who now lay a few feet away, a silent sentinel against the storm. Her journey west was far from over. It had only just truly begun, reshaped by flood and a silent, enigmatic ranger. The journey north was a grueling testament to the land's unforgiving nature and Elias's grim endurance. They moved through a landscape transformed by the flood, a vast canvas of muted greens and browns, where submerged trees stood like drowned giants, and the remnants of human habitation were reduced to scattered debris. The silence of the wilderness was broken only by the slosh of the horse's hooves, the distant cry of a solitary bird, and the whisper of the wind through skeletal branches. Ilara, still numb from the cold and the shock, clung to Elias's back, her muscles aching, her mind a blank slate save for the insistent beat of survival. He rode with an unwavering focus, his gaze sweeping the horizon, his hand resting casually, yet possessively, on the hilt of his holstered revolver. It was a silent assertion of control, a constant reminder of the volatile world they inhabited. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light of dawn and dusk, by the meager, cold rations Elias provided, and by the rare, almost imperceptible moments of shared humanity. He would dismount to check the horse, to scout ahead, and during these brief pauses, Ilara would catch glimpses of the man beneath the hardened exterior. The subtle way he eased the mare's saddle, the quiet concern in his eyes as he inspected its hooves, spoke of a deep respect for his animal, a loyalty she hadn't yet experienced from any human. These were small, fleeting cracks in his formidable armor, hints of something beneath the grim resolve. They spoke little, their conversations clipped and pragmatic. Water ahead. Storm coming. Stay close. Each word was a chipped stone, carefully placed, building a foundation of necessity rather than intimacy. One afternoon, a chilling discovery shattered the fragile peace. They stumbled upon a small homestead, half submerged, its windows dark, its door ajar. The silence here was different, more profound, a heavy blanket of dread. Elias dismounted, his hand already on his weapon, his posture coiled and alert. Ilara, hesitant, stayed on the horse, her heart seizing with an inexplicable fear. He moved with the caution of a predator, his senses finely tuned. From within the house, a guttural cry, then a desperate, almost animalistic whimper. Elias moved faster, disappearing into the shadows of the doorway. Ilara heard a scuffle, a sharp thud, then another cry, cut short. When he emerged moments later, his face was grim, his eyes shadowed, but there was no blood, no visible sign of conflict. He simply carried a small, emaciated dog, shivering and terrified, its ribs showing starkly beneath its matted fur. He cradled it with a surprising tenderness, a fleeting glimpse of vulnerability in the granite of his demeanor. "Starved," he muttered, his voice rough. He found some dried jerky, crushed it, and offered it to the whimpering animal, which devoured it with a frantic hunger. The act was a stark contradiction to his hardened exterior, a profound moment that shifted Ilara's perception of him, even if only slightly. This man, who was a force of grim survival, also harbored a deep, buried compassion. The encounter left an unsettling feeling in their wake, the lingering scent of despair, and an unspoken question about the fate of the homestead's inhabitants. It was a stark reminder that the flood wasn't their only adversary, that other, unseen dangers lurked in the desolate, forgotten corners of this ravaged world. The dog, now curled protectively in Elias's saddlebag, became a silent witness to their journey, a small, fragile life tethered to their relentless passage through a land of ruin. The presence of the small, rescued dog, whimpering softly in Elias's saddlebag, became a strange focal point in their relentless journey. It was a tangible testament to Elias's concealed empathy, a crack in the formidable wall of his solitude. Ilara found herself watching him more closely, seeing the subtle shifts in his posture when the dog stirred, the way his fingers, so rough and battle-worn, would gently brush against its fur. He was a man of contradictions, a silent enigma. Her own thoughts, too, began to shift from simple survival to a deeper, more reflective introspection. The days on the road, the endless, desolate landscapes, offered little distraction from the insistent echoes of her past. She had chased a new life, a clean slate, but the mud and the silence only seemed to stir up the sediment of old memories. Flashback, the advertisement, clipped from a soiled newspaper, promising a respectable future in a flourishing new territory. The words were so appealing, so full of the shimmering illusion of escape. Her mother, her face etched with worry and the unspoken shame of their family, urging her to consider it, to seize this chance at a life beyond the reach of local gossip. The desperation in her mother's eyes, the quiet despair that had driven Ilara to sign the contract, to entrust her fate to a stranger's fleeting promise. She remembered the journey, the stifling heat of the train, the endless rattle of the tracks, each mile carrying her further from her shattered world, yet closer to an unknown destiny. She had imagined a quiet, sturdy man, a small house with curtains at the windows, perhaps a garden, a simple, honest life where her past would remain buried, forgotten. The irony of her current situation, trapped in a waterlogged wilderness with a battle-scarred ranger, was not lost on her. Her dreams had been washed away, replaced by the stark, unyielding reality of survival. The hope she had clung to, that fragile, delicate thing, had withered in the relentless damp and cold. Yet, in its place, a different kind of strength began to grow, a stubborn resilience forged in hardship. She spoke then, her voice stronger than before, cutting through the oppressive silence. "What happened to your face?" The question hung in the air, blunt and direct, a stark contrast to her previous timidity. Elias stiffened slightly, his back to her, his shoulders tightening imperceptibly. He paused, the sound of the horse's hooves against the mud the only response. Then, a low, guttural sound, almost a growl, escaped his lips. "War," he said, the single word laden with a lifetime of pain and conflict. It was not an explanation, but a dismissal, a boundary set with absolute finality. The scars were not just physical. They were the visible manifestation of deeper wounds, of a past he refused to revisit, a history too raw to touch. Ilara understood. Some scars were meant to be left untouched, their stories too painful to share. His terse answer, however, opened another, equally pressing question in her mind. "What kind of war?" This land felt steeped in a quiet violence, a tension that hummed beneath the surface of the natural world. The knowledge of his past, however incomplete, transformed him further in her eyes. He was no longer just a grim rescuer, but a veteran of unseen battles carrying burdens she couldn't fathom. The connection between them, born of necessity and a shared silence, deepened, intertwining their paths in the desolate, unforgiving landscape. The air grew heavy with an unspoken tension, thicker than the lingering mists of the receding flood. Elias's curt declaration, war, had opened a subtle, yet profound chasm between them, hinting at a past far more complex and violent than Alara could have imagined. He was a man shaped by conflict, and the unspoken weight of his experiences settled upon their journey. They continued north, the landscape slowly transforming from submerged plains to rolling hills, though still scarred by the flood's passage. Trees stood as gaunt monuments, their branches stripped bare, their roots exposed as if ripped from the very fabric of the earth. The sky, though still a somber gray, held the promise of eventual clearing, a faint, almost imperceptible lightening on the distant horizon. Yet the sense of foreboding only intensified. One afternoon, as they crested a small ridge, the silence was shattered by a distant metallic clang, followed by another, sharper sound. Elias froze, his hand instinctively going to his rifle. His eyes, usually unreadable, now held a dangerous glint, scanning the ravaged land below. Alara, her heart seizing, followed his gaze. In the hollow of a valley, a makeshift encampment emerged from the haze, a collection of rough tents and lean-tos, smoke curling from a crude fire. It was not the kind of settlement that promised aid. These were not desperate survivors. They were a motley group, rough-looking men, their faces hardened, their clothing stained and tattered. They moved with a predatory ease, their movements deliberate, their eyes scanning the desolate landscape with a possessive glint. They were the scavengers of the ruined world, the opportunists who fed on desperation. Ilara's instincts screamed danger. These were the societal figures Elias had implicitly warned her against, the dark reflection of a world broken not just by nature, but by the worst of humanity. As Elias tried to guide the horse away, to skirt the edges of their camp unnoticed, a sharp whistle pierced the air. Too late. They had been spotted. One of the men, a hulking figure with a scarred cheek and a menacing glint in his eye, pointed them out. A wave of rough shouts followed, punctuated by the metallic click of a rifle being cocked. Elias didn't hesitate. He spurred the horse, transforming their slow, deliberate pace into a desperate, jarring gallop. The mare, powerful and swift, plunged down the hill, but the terrain was treacherous, riddled with hidden obstacles and softened by the flood. Ilara clung to Elias, her eyes wide with terror, the wind whipping past her ears, the shouts of the men behind them growing closer. A shot rang out, impossibly loud in the still air, kicking up a spray of mud just behind them. Elias swore, a raw, guttural sound, his grip tightening on the reins. He urged the horse faster, his movements a blur of controlled urgency. Another shot, closer this time, splintering a tree branch above their heads. They were being hunted. Flashback. Elias, younger but still grim, his face caked with grime and sweat, lying prone in a muddy trench, the air alive with the whistle of bullets. The screams of men, the stench of gunpowder and blood, a blinding flash, then the searing pain that ripped across his face, a sudden, all-consuming agony. He remembers the cold, calculated precision of the enemy, the utter disregard for human life. He remembers the impossible choice, the brutal efficiency required to survive in a landscape of pure, unadulterated violence. The memory was fragmented, a painful shard of his past, but it fueled his movements now, infusing them with a ruthless efficiency. He was no longer just a ranger. He was a warrior, instinctively falling back on the brutal lessons learned in a different kind of war. He knew these men, recognized the hunger in their eyes, the lawless gleam that bespoke of desperation and savagery. He steered the horse towards a dense copse of waterlogged trees, a desperate gamble for cover. The branches whipped at them, threatening to tear them from the saddle, but it was their only chance. Ilara closed her eyes, bracing for impact, for the searing pain of a bullet, for the unthinkable. The world narrowed to the thunder of the horse's hooves, the ragged beat of her own heart, and the chilling proximity of pursuit. The hunter had become the hunted, and the game was deadly. The chase was a visceral, heart-pounding nightmare, a primal race against desperate men. Elias, his face a mask of grim determination, pushed the horse relentlessly, weaving through the treacherous terrain, every muscle in his body coiled with a dangerous tension. Ilara clung to him, her knuckles white, her breath catching in ragged gasps. The air thrummed with unspoken danger, with the chilling knowledge that their pursuers meant them harm. The shouts of the men grew fainter, then closer again, a chilling ebb and flow that kept her heart in a constant state of panic. Elias muttered something under his breath, a low, fierce curse she couldn't quite make out, but the intent was clear. He would not yield. They crashed through a thicket of drowned reeds, the water spraying around them, and emerged onto a narrow, rocky path that clung to the side of a steep embankment. Below, the river, now a turbulent, angry beast, raged against its banks, its current swift and unforgiving. Elias didn't hesitate. He urged the horse forward, its hooves clattering precariously on the slick stones. One misstep, one slip, and they would plunge into the unforgiving depths. Ilara squeezed her eyes shut, a silent prayer escaping her lips. This was a man who embraced impossible choices, a silent warrior who pushed the boundaries of survival. From behind them, a chorus of triumphant shouts erupted. They had gained ground. Elias risked a glance over his shoulder, his eyes narrowed. The leader of the group, the man with the scarred cheek and a cruel grin, raised his rifle, aiming deliberately. Time seemed to slow. Ilara saw the glint of the barrel, the flicker of sunlight on metal, and an icy dread seized her. Elias, without warning, abruptly reined in the horse, pulling it to a rearing halt. He swung his leg over, a blur of motion, and in a single, fluid movement, pulled his rifle from its scabbard. Before Ilara could comprehend his intent, he barked a single terse command. "Stay." His eyes, hard and cold, met hers for a fleeting second, conveying an unspoken demand for absolute obedience. Then he dismounted, leaving her perched precariously on the horse, exposed, vulnerable. He took cover behind a cluster of gnarled, ancient trees, his movements precise, deadly. The hunter had become the counter-hunter. A shot cracked, then another, the air filled with the sharp scent of gunpowder. Ilara, her heart in her throat, watched in horrified fascination. Elias was a force of nature, a harbinger of retribution. He moved with a brutal efficiency, his rifle a silent extension of his will. The sound of a man screaming, cut short, then another. The shouts of the scavengers faltered, replaced by cries of confusion, then terror. Elias was a phantom in the desolate landscape, striking with swift, decisive force. Flashback. The cold resolve in Elias's younger eyes as he carried out a grim order, a necessary evil in a war that demanded such sacrifices. The weight of command, the burden of protecting his men, the chilling realization that to survive, one had to become as ruthless as the enemy. The echoes of his captain's voice, harsh and unyielding. Sometimes, Ranger, a man has to break the law to uphold justice, and sometimes you just have to survive. The memory of a brutal ambush, and the split-second decision that saved his platoon but damned his conscience. The sounds of the skirmish slowly subsided, replaced by an eerie silence. Elias emerged from the trees, his clothes muddied, his face streaked with grime but otherwise unharmed. He didn't look back at the fallen, didn't spare them a glance. His eyes swept over Ilara, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them before settling back into their usual guardedness. He was a man who understood the darkness of the world, and he had faced it without flinching. He mounted the horse, his movements precise, and without a word, reached back, pulling Ilara forward to her original position behind him. The scent of gunpowder still clung to him, a stark reminder of the violence he was capable of, the grim efficiency of his survival. The encounter, brief and brutal, had shaken Ilara to her core, but it had also solidified a terrifying truth. Elias was dangerous, but he was also her protector. He was a morally ambiguous figure, navigating a world where the lines between right and wrong were blurred by desperation and the bitter demands of survival. The violence, stark and swift, had left an indelible mark on the landscape and on Ilara's soul. The lingering scent of gunpowder and the chilling silence that followed Elias's brutal efficiency pressed in on her, forcing a confrontation with the true nature of her rescuer. He was a force of controlled destruction, capable of both surprising tenderness towards a starving dog and unflinching ruthlessness towards those who threatened their survival. The dichotomy was unsettling, yet it solidified a terrifying truth. He was dangerous, but his danger was directed outward, a shield against the pervasive malevolence of the post-flood world. Her heart still hammered, but the initial terror began to recede, replaced by a strange, numb awe. As they continued their arduous journey, the land slowly began to recover, the dark, muddy expanses giving way to patches of emergent green, a testament to nature's relentless cycle of renewal. But Ilara's inner landscape remained scarred, turbulent. The encounter with the scavengers had ripped away the last vestiges of her naive hope for a simple, tranquil escape. This new life she had sought was not one of quiet domesticity, but of stark survival, fraught with unseen dangers and brutal necessities. She found herself watching Elias, not with fear, but with a growing, complicated curiosity. His silence, once a barrier, now felt like a vault, holding secrets of a past that had forged him into this formidable, battle-scarred man. His every movement, every terse word, became a piece of a puzzle she felt compelled to solve. The sun, a welcome stranger, finally broke through the relentless clouds, casting long, stark shadows across the rugged terrain. The light, though gentle, illuminated the subtle lines of weariness around Elias's eyes, the faint tremor in his hand as he guided the horse, a flicker of vulnerability she hadn't noticed before. He was not an unfeeling machine, merely a man who had learned to suppress the weight of his burdens. "You saved me," she said, her voice quiet, almost a whisper, yet firm enough to penetrate the silence. It wasn't a question but a simple statement of fact, an acknowledgement that she owed him her very life. He didn't reply immediately, his gaze fixed on the horizon, but she felt a subtle shift in his posture, a slight tightening of his shoulders. After a long moment, his voice, rougher than usual, broke the silence. "Didn't have a choice." The words were blunt, dismissive, yet Ilara sensed a deeper truth beneath them. It wasn't resignation, but a reluctant admission of a deeply ingrained moral code, a desperate refusal to abandon another human being to the ravages of a world gone mad. He wasn't a hero, not in the traditional sense, but a man driven by an obscure sense of duty, a deeply buried sense of responsibility that defied his cynical exterior. Flashback. Elias, a young ranger, fresh-faced and idealistic, stands before his grizzled captain, his uniform crisp. The captain speaks of honor, of duty, of the unspoken code that binds men in the wilderness. "Some battles, Ranger," he says, "aren't won with guns, but with a stubborn heart. You see a soul in need, you extend a hand. That's the law of this land, son, older than any government decree." The words echo in the barren landscape of Elias's memory, a faint flicker of a long-lost moral compass, buried deep beneath layers of trauma and disillusionment. The memory, though unseen by Ilara, informed his reticence, the deep-seated belief that such acts were simply what a man did, not something to be glorified or even acknowledged. They were moments of profound tension, the air thick with unspoken emotions, with the weight of their shared experiences. Ilara felt a peculiar shift within herself. The fear was still there, a dull ache, but it was now tempered by a profound sense of gratitude and a growing, unsettling sense of connection to this battle-scarred ranger. Their journey was far from over, but the nature of their relationship had irrevocably changed. She was no longer just a rescued victim. She was a witness, a silent observer of a man haunted by his past, yet still capable of profound, if gruff, acts of humanity. The landscape opened up before them, leading them towards an uncertain future, but now the path felt less solitary, less entirely hopeless. The raw, almost accusatory admission of his past, war, had been a chink in Elias's formidable armor, exposing a wound that time had failed to heal. Now, after the skirmish, the brutal necessity of his actions forced Ilara to confront the full scope of his complex nature. He was a paradox, a protector capable of unflinching violence, a silent sentinel harboring a hidden wellspring of grim compassion. Their journey, once a desperate flight from the flood, had morphed into a deeper, more perilous odyssey through the scarred terrain of a broken world, and into the even more intricate landscape of Elias's veiled past. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was laden with unspoken questions, with the weight of shared experiences, with the growing, complicated awareness of their interdependence. Days bled into a week, then more, as they pressed relentlessly north, away from the worst of the flood's devastation, yet deeper into a wilderness that still bore the marks of conflict. They encountered scattered homesteads, abandoned and ransacked, silent testaments to the ravages of both water and human avarice. Each desolate scene served as a grim reminder of the fragile line between order and chaos, a line Elias seemed to straddle with an unsettling ease. Elara observed him, absorbed his every nuanced movement, every subtle shift in his hardened expression. She noted the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, alert to every rustle in the undergrowth, every distant wisp of smoke. He was a man perpetually on guard, living by a code forged in fire and loss. One evening, huddled around a meager fire, the small rescued dog nestled contentedly at Elias's feet. A question escaped Elara's lips, softer than her usual blunt inquiries. What happened to Havenwood? The note. He didn't wait. The words were hesitant, raw with the lingering sting of betrayal. Elias's gaze, fixed on the flickering flames, seemed to deepen, drawing the light into their dark depths. The muscles in his jaw tightened, a subtle tension that spoke volumes. The open loop of her fiancé's abandonment, the mystery of the town's swift and utter demise, was finally within reach. He didn't look at her, his voice a low rumble, laced with a bitter irony. Havenwood was never a haven. He paused, a long, drawn-out moment as if sifting through painful memories. It was built on a lie, a promise of prosperity for those desperate enough to believe it. His words were heavy, each syllable imbued with a weary cynicism. The man you were supposed to marry, he was one of them, the schemers. They knew the flood was coming. They bought up the land cheap, sold it off to folks like you, promised them the world. Then, when the river swelled, they took what they could and vanished. Elara's breath hitched, a cold wave of realization washing over her. The betrayal was deeper, more calculated, more insidious than she had ever imagined. She wasn't just forgotten. She was a pawn, an expendable part of a cruel deception. The anger, dormant for so long, flared within her, a hot, bitter flame. So it wasn't just the flood, she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and despair. It was them. They lured us there to die. The irony was brutal, a twisted mockery of her desperate search for a new life. Elias finally turned, his dark eyes meeting hers across the fire, their gaze unwavering. Not to die, necessarily. To be left behind. To be forgotten. Less complicated that way. His words were stark, devoid of sentimentality, yet they held a profound truth. He spoke of the harsh reality of human nature, of the darker impulses that drove men to exploit the desperate. His scars, the visible testament to a war fought on battlefields, now seemed to mirror the unseen scars of a different kind of conflict, a constant struggle against human greed and depravity. The mystery of Havenwood was finally revealed, tying Elias's past, his cynicism, directly to the very nature of the ravaged world they navigated. He was not just a survivor, he was a silent crusader against the very forces that had sought to destroy Elara. The climax of their journey had begun, not with an explosion of violence, but with the quiet, devastating revelation of a profound deception and the dawning realization of a shared, bitter truth. The revelation about Havenwood's betrayal struck Elara with the force of a physical blow, stripping away the last fragile layers of her illusion. Her fiancé, the promise of a future, the very land itself, all had been a calculated deception, a cruel trap for the desperate. The anger that flared within her was not just for herself, but for all the others lured by false hope, left to drown in the metaphorical and literal currents of human avarice. This was the true battlefield, she realized. A war waged not with guns, but with greed. And Elias, in his grim, silent way, had been fighting it his entire life. The realization solidified their bond, transforming it from one of necessity to a profound, almost spiritual alliance against the insidious darkness of the world. The climax of their shared journey had begun, not with an explosion of violence, but with the quiet, devastating unraveling of a profound deception. Elias watched her, his expression unreadable, yet Alara sensed a shift, a softening around the edges of his usual grim resolve. He knew this kind of pain, this profound disillusionment. His own scars, the visible testament to a war fought on battlefields, now seemed to mirror the unseen scars of a different kind of conflict, a constant struggle against human cruelty. He reached into his satchel, pulling out a small, tarnished silver locket. He held it out to her, his fingers calloused and strong, uncharacteristically gentle. "My mother's," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly whisper, barely audible above the crackle of the fire. Said it would bring truth to light. It was an offering, a profound gesture of trust, a breaking of his long-held silence. The locket was a small, fragile thing, yet in his hand it felt imbued with the weight of generations, of a fragile hope passed down through hardship. Alara took it, her fingers brushing his. The metal was cool against her skin, a stark contrast to the sudden warmth that bloomed in her chest. She opened it, her breath catching. Inside, nestled beneath a clouded pane of glass, was a faded sepia-toned photograph. A stern-faced woman with kind eyes, and beside her, a young boy, no older than 7, his face unmarred, his eyes shining with a youthful innocence that was almost heartbreakingly familiar. It was Elias, younger, unburdened by the scars of war and the cruelties of the world, yet unmistakably him. The truth, in this moment, was not a bitter pill, but a quiet, tender unveiling. This simple act, this offering of a piece of his vulnerable past, shattered the last of Elias's impenetrable walls. He had carried his past in silence, a heavy burden, but now he was sharing it, allowing her to see the man beneath the warrior. Flashback. Elias, a boy, clings to his mother's skirt, watching her tend to a wounded traveler in their remote cabin. Her hands gentle and swift, binding wounds, offering what little comfort they possessed. Her voice soft yet firm, speaking of the duty to help, the inherent goodness that must be sought even in the darkest of times. "A ranger's true strength, son," she had said, "isn't just his rifle but his heart, knowing when to fight and when to heal." The memory is a poignant reminder of the ideals he once held, the values that had been eroded by the harsh realities of a broken world, yet never entirely extinguished. "She taught me," he continued, his voice a low murmur, "that even in the darkest places there's always a choice, to turn away or to make a stand." His words were not a confession, but a quiet declaration, an explanation for the man he had become, the hardened protector who still carried a flicker of that youthful idealism. The air thickened with unspoken emotion, with the profound weight of shared vulnerability. Alara saw him then, not as an enigma, but as a deeply flawed, emotionally complex man, scarred by a life of impossible choices, yet driven by an unwavering, if hidden, moral compass. The hopeful resolution, nascent and fragile, began to blossom not in the promise of romantic love, but in the profound understanding forged between two souls who had found each other amidst the wreckage of a broken world. The journey, harrowing as it had been, had not only led them to safety but to a deeper, more resonant truth about resilience, empathy, and the quiet strength found in shared burdens. The dawn broke, painting the bruised sky with hues of cautious hope, a subtle shift from the perpetual gray that had shadowed their journey. The air, crisp and cold, held the clean scent of pine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the lingering decay of the flooded towns. Elias and Alara sat by the embers of their fire, the small locket now clasped firmly in Alara's hand, its cool metal a tangible link to Elias's revealed past. The silence between them was no longer tense, but settled, imbued with the quiet understanding that had blossomed in the crucible of their shared ordeal. The harsh realities of the world remained, but their perception of it, and of each other, had irrevocably changed. Elias had shared a piece of himself, a vulnerability that transcended words, and Alara had received it, not with judgment, but with a dawning sense of kinship. Her own shattered dreams, the bitter sting of betrayal, now felt less raw, tempered by the stark reality of the world. and the unexpected solace found in this battle-scarred ranger's stoic presence. She understood now that true hope wasn't found in promises on paper, but in the resilience of the human spirit, in the quiet acts of courage and compassion that defied the overwhelming darkness. The journey, a desperate flight, had become a profound exploration of endurance and the unexpected bonds forged in the crucible of hardship. They spoke of the future, not in grand declarations, but in practical, grounded terms, their voices low and steady. "North," Elias repeated, his gaze fixed on the rising sun. "There's a settlement, small, hardened, but it's beyond the floodwaters. They'll need hands." His words were blunt, unsentimental, yet they offered a clear path forward, a tangible destination beyond the immediate peril. It wasn't a promise of paradise, but a simple, honest opportunity to rebuild, to forge a new existence from the ashes of the old. Ilara listened, her eyes tracing the familiar weathered lines of his face, the scars that now seemed less like blemishes and more like the marks of a survivor, a testament to a life lived on the fringes, fiercely protecting what little remained of human decency. The little dog stirred, stretching, then hopped onto Elias's lap, looking up at him with trusting eyes. He stroked its head, a rare, almost imperceptible softening of his stern features. It was a small, tender moment, a quiet affirmation of the gentle spirit that lay beneath his formidable exterior. This was the man who had rescued her, who had faced down predators both human and natural, and who, in his own gruff way, had offered her a chance at something truer than the false promises of Havenwood. As they prepared to move, the sun now fully risen, bathing the land in a golden, almost ethereal light, Ilara took one last look back at the desolate landscape they were leaving behind. The water had receded further, revealing more of the ruined town, a haunting silhouette against the brightening sky. It was a symbol of what she had lost, but also of what she had survived. The horse, rested and powerful, seemed to embody their renewed resolve, its steady breathing a rhythmic promise of endurance. She mounted behind Elias, the familiar comfort of his broad back a silent reassurance. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges, but they would face it together, two solitary figures bound by the crucible of shared hardship and an unspoken understanding. The dramatic journey had led them not to a conventional happy ending, but to a deeper, more grounded resolution, the quiet strength found in mutual respect, the enduring possibility of healing, and the enduring hope that even in a world broken by flood and betrayal, humanity could still find its way back to itself, one gruff, battle-scarred ranger and one resolute mail-order bride at a time. Their story was not over. It was just beginning, etched into the vast, resilient landscape of the American West.